Hello, I'm Erin Barber, and today I'm going to be presenting my presentation on using augmented feedback to improve performance of well-trained endurance runners. My reg number is 206981. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I will be discussing today. First of all, I'm going to briefly discuss what feedback is, and in particular, what augmented feedback is, and what we could do instead of augmented feedback. The factors that influence running performance, so how we can tell the difference between elite runners. And then we're going to dive into some evidence on augmented feedback in endurance runners, whether or not it improves or doesn't improve running economy and performance. We're going to discuss the restrictions of augmented feedback and some strategies of using augmented feedback, and then conclude from here. So feedback is given either during or after the exercise has been executed and is based on the performance of the athlete. So this is opposed to instructions, which are often given before and are not based on the performance. As a coach, you would give feedback to supply the athlete with information on how they perform the exercise, reinforce key points on their movements, use it as an encouragement. So if we notice the mood of the athlete is quite down, and we need to lift their spirits to encourage their training, we can encourage them. And it can also be used as a punishment to give them corrections on how to improve their exercises and their movements. So in terms of feedback, there are two different main types of feedback. So we have intrinsic and augmented. We will be focusing on augmented today, but intrinsic feedback is whereby the athlete focuses on giving themselves feedback based on how they feel. So if we have our endurance runner, as they're running, for example, a 10K, they will be able to give themselves internal cues, adjust, for example, dorsiflexing stiff ankles, ensuring the shoulders are relaxed. They will give themselves feedback as they're moving. So there are different ways that the athlete can do this. They can do this through visual, auditory, cutaneous, or proprioceptive ways. Okay, but today we're going to be focusing on augmented feedback, which is an external type of feedback given to the athlete and usually by a coach or another athlete. And this is where the coach or athlete will cue and tell the athlete that has been performing the exercise where they need to make adjustments. So to complete augmented feedback, we need to have a knowledge of performance and a knowledge of results. Okay, so with intrinsic feedback, it can be really useful for athletes who already have a good base level of knowledge, particularly elite athletes, because they know how their body feels during certain exercises. However, it might be too complex for novice athletes and those that are underdeveloped in the skills. Whereas augmented is good for beginner athletes because it allows a coach to teach them how to execute the movements well. It will also give them some motivation and give them some reassurance on the movements. Augmented feedback is also great for fast sports such as sprinting, where it may not be possible to give as much intrinsic feedback because the movement is so quick. However, with intrinsic feedback, the athlete may become too reliant on the coach and not be able to give themselves their own feedback cues. So with this, there are some strategies that we can develop with augmented feedback to limit the amount that the athlete is becoming reliant on the coach. So knowledge of results frequency. So we can taper back how often we give them feedback. Another example is knowledge of results estimate. So before we give the feedback to the athlete, we can ask them questions about how they felt the movements and the exercises were, whether they think they performed them well, what they think they could have improved on before giving them our feedback. And also summary knowledge of results. So instead of giving the athlete the points after every single repetition of the movement or after the run, we do it in the set. So we allow them to perform a full set and then we give them a summary of the feedback. So this just limits how much we're adjusting the athlete's movements. So moving on to running performance now. There are two very important factors that determine running performance. So the first one, which is the most well known, is VO2 max. So this is the maximal rate the body can effectively use oxygen during exercise. So this is the most common use to measure aerobic capacity. And then on the other hand, we have running economy, which, as Moore states, is the rate of oxygen consumed at a given submaximal running velocity. So although VO2 max is primarily used, there is very little difference in the VO2 max of elite endurance runners. Therefore, we use running economy instead because that is where we see the divide between the elite runners. There is a very big difference between elite, untrained male and female runners in their running economy. The thing is, with running economy, naive and intermediate and novice runners haven't usually acquired the experience to self-optimize. So they aren't able to make those micro adjustments to improve their running economy. So some factors that can improve and influence running economy are spatiotemporal factors, neuromuscular, low limb kinematics, upper and trunk kinematics, biomechanical kinetics, and also an external factor is the shoe and the surface interaction. So the depth of our heel, our running shoes, whether we're running in trainers or we're barefoot running. So just before we delve into augmented feedback and running economy, I just want to give a brief overview of some signs of good running economy. So Moore points out a few factors that we see in athletes, endurance athletes that have good running economy. So we have greater plantar flexion velocity, greater maximal thigh extension angle, greater knee flexion during stance. We have a reduced peak hip flexion during braking. We have maintained a neutral arm swing and usually a larger stride angle. And I've just popped in there as well. However, there is inconclusive evidence to suggest that there is any difference between rear foot and forefoot striking in running economy. One important factor that does determine running economy, though, is that athletes that require greater muscle activation to propel them forward when running are not fully utilizing the efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle. And this can have a detrimental effect on running economy. So it is necessary for the athlete to be using the stretch shortening cycle as efficiently as possible to improve their running economy. Okay, so just moving on to some studies of augmented feedback. This one is focused on gait retraining for injured and healthy runners using an augmented feedback. So this one uses auditory and visual feedback throughout the practice. So this is a research report. So this is compiled all of the reports dated from way back, and it takes the studies that are acceptable and compiles the data to try and bring an overview of the results. So with this study, with this report, 10 studies were identified as acceptable. 2 of these studies had high methodological quality and 8 had moderate. So that was from scaling down from all the rest of the studies, only 10 were deemed suitable. So from these previous studies, they've concluded that running mechanics have been improved from augmented feedback sessions. And as a result of this, there has been a reduction in running related pain and symptoms. So some of the symptoms that were pointed out in this study were tibial stress fractures, medial stress syndrome. And the study also highlights that between 19 and 79% of runners do experience some form of lower body injury throughout their running lifetime. So the general consensus in the literature literature is that augmented feedback was effective in reducing the magnitude of ground reaction force, and also reduce the vertical instantaneous loading rate, vertical average loading rate, and vertical impact peak. So these high loading rates are usually considered as factors that can contribute to lower body injuries in running, such as tibial stress fractures, plantar fasciitis, and medial stress syndrome. So by reducing these through our augmented feedback, we're reducing the chances of these syndromes and injuries. So the overall outcome of this study, it was agreed that auditory and visual feedback is effective in modifying lower extremity movement patterns that are related to injuries. So this is a really important study to show that the lower body mechanics can be changed through augmented feedback. And it does highlight that it can reduce the amount of injuries that runners are experiencing. However, it doesn't actually highlight that there is any improvement in running economy here, which is what we're looking at. And also, there isn't a lot of evidence out of all of the evidence here. There are only 10 studies that have been deemed acceptable and only 2 of a high methodological quality. So we have to take that into account, that there isn't a lot of research on augmented feedback to retraining the gaits. Okay, so this is just a really short study that I put in here on the effect of augmented feedback on ground reaction time. So the shorter the ground reaction time, the quicker the athlete is usually moving, the more economically they're running. So in this study, there were high-performing running athletes and low-performing running athletes who performed a 10,000 meter run on a 200 meter indoor track. And the results of this came out that the top runners had a significantly shorter ground reaction and braking phase than the low-performing runners. So with this study, there was another study that was later performed that included that as part of the research. And this was on the effect of augmented feedback on ground contact time. So augmented feedback was used in the study because, due to how quickly ground reaction time lasts, between 100 and 250 milliseconds, it's necessary to provide aid for feedback, as we're not able to intrinsically make the adjustments as quickly as we would be with augmented feedback, being able to slow down video and show the results. So in this study, all of the groups who received the same training. It's broken down into 3 groups. However, only one group received augmented feedback within their training program. This was a 4-week study, and of all 3 of the groups, only the augmented feedback group reduced their ground contact time. And they used augmented feedback by displaying the ground contact time after each run and then giving the feedback on this. So as well as there being a shorter ground contact time for the athletes that had a augmented feedback, it also created a significant change in their running technique, as it reduced step frequency and prolonged their swing time. So these are key points to notice, that the athletes are running faster. However, it was only a 4-week study, so we cannot confirm the long-term effects of augmented feedback on ground contact time. And out of the study, despite the fact that ground contact time was reduced with augmented feedback, there was actually no significant correlation between improved performance and reduced ground contact time. So although the study was trying to find out, A, if ground contact time was reduced from augmented feedback, they were also trying to discover whether that reduced ground contact time would improve the running economy. And unfortunately, there was no significance. It was too small to correlate the two. So moving on from here, there was another study by Faulkner to discover the effect of accurate and inaccurate distance augmented feedback. So in the study, we had 13 university sportsmen who ran 4 6-kilometre treadmill time trials. Each had over a 48-hour rest period. And the groups, they each run had accurate feedback, inaccurate feedback, and no feedback. So this meant that this display on the treadmills was covered up, so they had no feedback on the time and the distance that they had ran. The study revealed that the group with no feedback had a slower completion time than the other 2 runs. However, there was no difference between the feedback groups. So whether they were given inaccurate feedback or accurate feedback, there was no difference substantial difference in the completion time. So this does show that there is a possibility that with augmented feedback, athletes will run quicker. The no feedback group started slower and then increased their velocity as they ran closer to the time and they got more comfortable. However, the other feedback groups started faster and remained quite consistent throughout. So this does show us that the augmented feedback, regardless of accurate or inaccurate, can improve our speed. However, again, with this, the no feedback group had a lower VO2 max and heart rate in the latter half of the run and had a better running economy compared to all of the augmented feedback trials. So again here, although we're seeing some improvements in running with the augmented feedback, there is no clear definition to say that it will improve running economy. And it's also important to note that in this study, we're using sportsmen from university and they aren't particularly elite endurance athletes. So they were sportsmen from a variety of different sports, not specifically running. Okay, so just to conclude from this presentation, although there are some points to show that augmented feedback can improve gait training, can potentially reduce the risk of injuries, lower limb injuries in runners, and potentially improve speed, there isn't a substantial enough amount of evidence to guarantee that augmented feedback improves performance in well-trained endurance athletes. We don't have enough research out there that correlates augmented feedback with endurance athletes. We have correlations between ground contact time, but then that correlation doesn't then move through into running economy. Now, once at an elite level, a lot of athletes use intrinsic feedback to make adjustments in order to improve running economy, especially in endurance sports such as longer distance running, where the athletes have time to make those adjustments, unlike sprinting, where it's a very quick movement and the athletes don't have as much time to make those changes. So there is some evidence to show that augmented feedback may be useful in retraining runners with previous injuries and possibly to avoid common running injuries so that the athletes are made aware of their specific movement patterns and can make adjustments to their gait. However, we need more studies on its influence on running economy. And also, just another point aside from this, we need more studies on whether augmented feedback is useful for novice and intermediate runners. As we saw in the Moore article on running economy, they have less awareness of their bodies and have not acquired the experience to self-optimize. So this could be a key area to look at where augmented feedback could be useful in improving the running economy and the biomechanics of novice and intermediate runners. Thank you.